Can we
Yeah,
go
let's
through all
continue.
this stuff?
Let's talk about ABC.
Okay, once ABC takes over? ABC gets me as a fringe character and a nobody. What I didn't realize, I still didn't get it. I never got it. I got it because, once again, nobody's watching my back. They never let me get they never let an agent get anywhere near me. So the only person who was watching my back was Agnes Nixon. I just found out in 1973 when she sold the show. I found out. She was, and I had a hard job with that because I thought to myself, oh, she was responsible for those hard edge renewals that I was stuck with. That meant that she was, I was always so far behind. Something happened. Al and I were out at lunch one day, and this is really and he was interested in directing, so he knew both. We were sort of under the same. He was talking when we finished lunch. We were friends, you know. We heard that Doris Quinlan was being fingered for getting rid of her. And Al was horrified. He came back and he told me, you know what those guys told me? They told me that management is going, ABC is going to go after Doris. And he had a very good relationship with her. He'd go up to her office and they were almost buddies. So he said, I don't think she knows. So when we got back to the studio where we shoot, he went up to her and she didn't know. She was horrified. And Al came back. He said, she doesn't know. I think we ought to do, it came to her as an absolute shock. I think we ought to tell her. And so we went, so he suggested that we go to his apartment and write a letter, a cast letter. Now, I had split feelings about that because I thought it was terribly unfair because I thought she was a good producer. But I also knew that she had, when she had done two things that were really distressing to me. There was a magazine called Daytime Television. And they did a library series in which for a year they did a special issue devoted just to one story. And they had done the storyline for us. And in his elegance, Paul Dennis had allowed Doris Quinlan to pose her own staff, her own people. They came to take the picture, but he had told her in advance she would be the one who would be allowed to pose her own cast for both the cover and the centerpiece, the center page spread. When the picture was taken, Doris worked for McGrath, and she sent me to the back row in a line of men. There were only two, as it ended up, there were only two women in the picture who were original stars. Doris Bellac, who sat down on the front couch with her family, and Ellen Holly, who stood in the back row. And I took the position. I didn't say anything about it. And Paul Dennis never said anything about it, but I'm sure he was, given the way he thought, I think he would have been shocked at what she had done. But do you know who was angry about where he put me? The White Crew. They were furious. They felt that I was responsible for all that show was getting, and they were angry that I was put in the back row. One guy said to me, gorgeous guy, my God, he looked like Sean Connery. He looked more gorgeous than anything they had in front of the camera. He said to me, honey, they could shove you to the back of the bus, but you're the only one in the whole bunch who looks like a movie star. I love that guy to this day. Anyway, the picture was worse than it seemed. I was very aware that nobody spoke Lillian's name. And I didn't bring it up because I felt so uncomfortable with management. I really didn't know what was going on. Immediately I called Lillian, and I found out that they never even told her that the shoot was taking place. We didn't say another word about it because we both knew that wasn't an accident. Because if she had been where she properly should be, she would have been right next to Doris Bellack on that front couch. I would have been on the arm of the chair where there was somebody else, and Al would have been standing right behind us. But that would have made her, because she looked so different from everybody else, the star of the picture. And the two blondes they cared about, Jackie Courtney and the third Vicky, would have looked like a pair of bookends. They weren't about to let that happen, and so they didn't even get in touch with her at all. So I had that against her. And then I had something else that was much more dreadful. Shall I go into it?
Yeah, if you like, please.
My nephew, that darling little boy on the wall over there, he died at 17 of a brain tumor, a glioblastoma. The same thing that a man I very much respect, John McCain, is struggling with now. He was 17. He was a writer. He was an artist. Such a good artist. They had a gallery showing of his name, of his work after he died. But what was so extraordinary about my nephew was the moment he found out he was dying, he made an art out of dying. He worried entirely about how devastated everybody was going to be who he left behind. That worried him so that he never said anything about being in pain. He never said, why me? God knows what he struggled with at night. And he did it, he laughed, he joked with his friends, and they said, don't you dare, don't you dare mourn me. If I go, I'm going to be up in heaven, and you're going to have a guardian angel who's going to look after you. Just you remember, he kept his sense of humor, he saw all his friends. He was, I think of him all the time, almost as a religious figure because of what he did. I can't imagine it. And my sister was concerned when he finally died. My sister was very concerned about his classmates because they were children, and that was too early in their life. So she made it clear, my sister Jean, she made it clear when he was lying outside, when he died and he was in his wake. It was when they cut the viewing. He made it clear to the children that she said, thank you for coming. We're so glad you're here. But this is a very rough thing for young people. Please, we would prefer that having said your goodbye to him, that you go home. But thank you for coming. They refused. Those children sat there for 2 hours and refused to go. And when the bell rang so that they could go because they were going to have somebody else come in, they went over and they kissed him goodbye. And when they were out in the hall, they started hanging on to each other and crying and going through. And there were white kids and black kids and Jewish kids and kids of every conceivable type. How could you ever hate anybody? They were all there crying because of my nephew. It was extraordinary. He was extraordinary. He still sort of is there in my family. And toward the end, everybody on the show knew, because once the Orthodox doctors wrote him off, for anybody you love, but specifically for a child, you grab everybody you know and you say, what do you know? What do you know about the underground? Laetrile. Do you have to go to Mexico or can you get it on the black market? What do you know about macrobiotic diets? Do they work? What do you know about the autogenous vaccines they're making in the Caribbean from a child's urine? What do you know? What do you know? What do you know? So I had everybody I had grabbed. We kept it as private business as long as we thought we were on top of it and he was going to get better. Once we knew that was not the case, and they said, go home and make him comfortable, then you get busy. So everybody knew. My first day back from my nephew's funeral, I walked into my dressing room, and they had given my dressing room to a white actress who was coming on the show who they didn't have a dressing room for. And they had put my things in the bullpen, which is where the extras dress. And for the next year, I dressed with the extras. There's no place you go. You don't have an agent. It's management. You say anything about management, you lose the only job you ever had. And I would remain, I never married. Not my idea. I was madly in love with 5 different men. 4 of them I'm still in love with. I think they're doll babies. But all of them, I fell in love with them when they were nobodies. And they all became stars. Some of them big stars. Some of them, my sister tells me, you should have been an agent. You would have made a lot more money if you'd been an agent. Anyway, I still love 4 of them. One of them was a horror story. Ron O'Neill, Superfly. I won't go into him. I give him a whole chapter in my book that he deserves. I don't want to go into that at all, but the rest of them were all doll babies. I still love them dearly. Okay, I'm saying that all of my life I have had to be responsible for every roof over my head and every meal on my table. So I'm not about to lose the only job I've ever had that puts a contract in front of me that says, because, you know, in theater, I'd play a gorgeous role and then no thing for months, then a gorgeous role and no thing for months, gorgeous thing for no. And I want to go back and talk about that little bit in theater because I'll get into that later. This was, I would first have a contract was for 1 year, then for 2 years. I was now working, anyway, the point is, I should have gotten out with that. Once they were able to do that behind my nephew's death, I learned who I was working with. And everything that, up until then, I wasn't sure who I was working with. But up until then, when that happened, I realized I was working with people that I had no connect, that I really was, I was working for the enemy. And from then on, I no longer had felt any kind of feelings about the show at all. It was something I had to do, and I would do well as I could, but love anybody in management, care about anybody in management? No. So anyway, Doris had done those 2 things, put me in the balance. So I went along with the letter, but at the end of the letter, Al said to me, you're lucky you're not married. You don't have anybody you have to watch out for. I do. And he had a wife who was, to give him credit, he had a wife who had some problems, medical problems. So I was aware of that. He said, I would prefer if you didn't go into my part in the letter. And I'm not stupid. I knew what he was doing. So I can't say that he fooled me, because he didn't. I knew that if it worked out and Doris Quinlan was kept on the basis of the letter, he would out himself as the knight in shining armor who came to her defense. And if it didn't work out that way, it was all on me. I knew that. So I take it on myself that I was dumb enough to go out and do that. That's all on El Stupido. Okay, so I went out and I and I had to twist arms to get people to do that. Well, and I went up to the tower at ABC and handed it over to all the big brass, the letter from the cast. They got angry. They gave Doris Quinlan her walking papers at the end of the week. She had to clean out her desk and be gone. And she was angry with me because I had put my black face into it and screwed things up. She was angry that the two blondes hadn't done it because that's who Fred Silverman would have paid attention to. And by sticking my black face in it, I had messed her up. So everybody was upset with me about that letter, including Agnes Nixon. I got the first phone call I had heard from Agnes Nixon in a dog's age. She got on the phone and let me know that it was very upsetting that the cast was getting into, and I realized that Jo Stewart was coming on the show as her favorite protege because she was the one who was pulling the chair out from Doris Quinlan, her own producer. And from then on, of course, I shut up because I felt I owed both women the same debt. They had both put me, and I couldn't do any more to help anybody. But that was my first knowledge that Agnes was the one who had pulled the thing on Doris, who had gotten rid of Doris Quinlan. And what I say that to say that that was my first inkling of what I would ultimately find out. And it made a lot of sense to me. Oh, well, first of all, I'll go into the fact that I started off with a bad relationship with Jo Stewart because I never said anything to Jo Stewart. Jo Stewart called me up to his office after he was put in. He said to me, "You're the only person in this company who has not been up here to wish me well for becoming the new producer." And I said, "Well, I have a problem with the king is dead, long live the king." I said, "But aside from that, I thought Doris was doing a good job. And aside from that, she's the person that I owed for my job. And I felt that it had nothing to do with you. It had very much to do with this is the woman that gave me my job. And I also felt she was doing a good job and it wasn't fair." And he said, "Well, I don't see it that way." And that was the end of it. I went through I was on a 3-year, I was now on a 3-year, that's how they kept keeping me, because this is the only place I could find a job, for goodness sakes, in America. I was on a 3-year thing.
Contract?
Contract, yes. Al sat down one day and said to me, "It's time one of us had an affair. Everybody's getting tired of this, bored with this perfect marriage, and so am I." And it wasn't even a romantic marriage. I mean, I didn't get chocolates on Valentine's Day or anything like that. It's, "Hi, honey, how did things go at the office?" So, you know, that he could go talking about the black storylines again. The white storylines again.
And you had an adopted son, right?
And we had an adopted. Oh, but that, yes. So that was that was earlier. I was getting to something later.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes. No, why? Oh, you remember when he was there? Yes, that was at the beginning of our marriage. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that was played by Lawrence Fishburne, right?
Lawrence Fishburne, yes, yes.
A very young Lawrence Fishburne.
Well, they hadn't thought about hiring him, but they saw him. I think he was only 13 years old. And they saw him in an off-Broadway, a television show called, I think it's called If You Want to Dance, You've Got to Play the Band. You've got to pay the band. And thought he was so extraordinary. They wrote that adoption thing about him. And so we adopted him. And he was a remarkably talented kid. And he was gone 2 years later, pulled off up to heaven and movies and whatever by Francis Ford Coppola, no less than Apocalypse Now. And from there on, it was a huge Hollywood success story. Yes, absolutely.
So I interrupted you. You were talking about the affair.
Oh yes, we had said goodbye to that. Live ended up for a bit, but anyway, so I went home and I wrote a proposal for the introduction of a character called Jack Scott, and I wrote it about the whole. I wrote from time to time for the show, and they were very happy to have me do so for nothing, because I was willing to do it for nothing. And I don't feel cheated by that, because I went into it with my eyes wide open, and from my point of view, politically, I was getting an enormous thing out of it. I was being able to get intelligent blacks on a camera, and for me, that was heaven. So I didn't care that they didn't want to go through a whole formal, we'll pay you if you, whatever. That's okay. You want to put me on for free? Good. So I don't feel gypped by that at all. I went into that for me and got what I wanted out of it, or would have if they hadn't done what they did. I wrote a proposal in which, because Al was so right about how boring our marriage is. You know, nobody wants to watch a perfect marriage. It's like watching paint dry, you know. So anyway, I wrote this proposal about this very tough guy who was a perfectionist and a whatever and a solo, who came to the hospital, Jack Scott. And because there have been such brilliant doctors in the Black historical past. You know, I mean, they rave about Ben Carson as if he's the most wonderful doctor in the world. Well, okay, he separated science to his twins. That's all very nice, but an awful lot of black doctors have done an awful lot of brilliant things, as, for instance, Daniel Hale Williams, who 100 years ago was the first doctor to operate successfully on the human heart. And Charles Drew, whose work on blood plasma made it possible for 10,000 GIs to come back from Europe in one piece after World War II. Because of his work in blood plasma, they were able to have a guy from the hospital tent on the battlefield with such portable equipment. He could be there and get at the guy the moment he fell, stick a thing in him, keep him from bleeding out in the 15 minutes it takes to get to the... That's Dr. Charles Drew. 10,000 men come back from World War II alive instead of dead because of that black doctor. So it's nothing new. Anyway, so I had this brilliant I wrote this brilliant black doctor because I knew so many in my private life. Brilliant black men. He was going to be a perfectionist and what have you and so on, and eventually we were going to fall in love and I was going to divorce Al, and then he was going to die. I'm all the time not thinking of making our marriage more interesting. This guy has to die. He can't...
The new character?
Yes, yes. And I had him dead at the end of his 2-year contract because Al suggested it to help our marriage. So we're going to help our marriage. He's going to die. And because he's a druggie is going to catch him in the laboratory and trying to steal drugs and kill him. So that Al can come in and find the killer, and then we can get back together, but have a rockier, more interesting marriage because of past things about, it's more complicated, complex. If they'll let me write a little more about it, well, you know what I'm saying. It could complicate. Okay. I wrote the proposal, and it went up on Doris Quinlan's watch, all the way up to Fred Silverman. By the time it got his imprimatur and came down, Joe Stewart was there. So he was the one that was going to cast the thing. I was, at the time, I had been engaged to be married to a brilliant actor called what's Jay's name? Wait a minute. I can't believe it. Jay Preston. J.A. Preston. And it was over. His idea, not mine. It was over. But he was a brilliant actor, and I thought he would be brilliant in the role. I tend, it's interesting, as far as men are concerned, I am more involved with what they sound like than what they look like. I've known gorgeous men who opened their mouth and that's the end of it. And I've known homely men that open their mouth and, oh. Anyway, Jay had this fabulous voice. And I could see him in that role and whatever. So I wrote them, whenever I wrote anything, I wrote them for actors that I knew. Not necessarily did you have to cast them, but it helped me to write them because I knew, so I wrote it the way Jay would have done it. Anyway, the one wonderful thing that Joe Stewart would do would be to fly him in to play the role. I sent him the script 2 weeks beforehand. When Jay got off the plane, and he hadn't learned the lines, I saw the whole thing happen. He was going to go in there, he was going to blow it, he was going to lose the job because he really didn't want it. He probably just took the airplane ride in to see his New York friends, and he really wanted to be out in California making movies. The moment he got off the plane and he hadn't learned those lines, I felt so betrayed. I crossed him off the list. And sure enough, that whole thing played out just the way I thought it was going to play out. And he made himself uncastable. And so I was called into Joe Stewart's office. He had promised me input, which I deserved, not only as the person who had to play opposite him, whoever was chosen, but as the writer who had created the character. He didn't ask me what I thought. He told me that he was about to sign a person I call Martin, because I have difficulty saying negative things about people unless I change their names. Martin, the person I call Martin in the book, was the one person that I had auditioned opposite that I was absolutely horrified by. I was standing next to somebody who so loathed me and detested me, it was all he could do to keep from, he just oozed this sense of repulsion at standing next to me. That when he told me he was going to cast this guy, I said, and then I realized I must not cry. The moment you cry, a man always thinks that's dirty pool because that's a card that's not in his hand. At least until John Boehner. I love John Boehner because he cried in public and he made it okay for men to cry. He got them all off the hook. Good for him. Okay, this was back in the days when men are not supposed to cry. So I knew that if I cried, he would think that was dirty pool. They've got all the cards in their hands. You know, as I say in my book, the louder voice to shout you down, the bigger muscles to beat you up, and the bigger job to yank yours. They've got all this in their hand. So, but still, you must not cry. So I tried to explain to him as clinically as possible that this wasn't a question of not feeling in sympathy with this guy or being on his same wavelength or whatever. It was a case of my feeling that I was, as I had never seen this man before, I was in the vicinity of a sociopath who I reminded him of someone in his life that he detested. I mean, it was as serious as that. I made it clear to him. I was petrified of working with him. And I made it clear that under no circumstances. I said, you took one of the early things in my proposal where I had written the hard part where we're raging at each other. I said, he will never be able to do a romantic. It's just not possible. He can't stand me. He oozes hate like perspiration. This is not, and he said, well, that's who I'm going to hire. I'm afraid you'll just have to make your peace with it. And then I broke down and I started sobbing. And I said to him, please don't do this to me. Please don't do this to me. And he dismissed me. He was furious. I begged him not to do it. And I saw him be so gentlemanly with, there was an actress on the show. She didn't like, he let her pick whoever she wanted to. And when she didn't like him, he changed it and let her pick somebody else for a second time. But boy, did he. And then he proceeded to jam that man down my throat for the 2 years of his contract. And I got to the place where I started to deteriorate as a person, because I'm one of those people who has to be absolutely ultra prepared to even have a shot at being able to go in and do the thing the right way. I would go into a day where whether I was left alone or whether I was called up and shoot out depended on somebody else's work, somebody else's performance. And this guy would come in the morning without having even looked at his script. And I was called up to the office. And Joe Stewart said to me, "You're intimidating him? You're forcing him to go up on his lines? Cut it out!" Like that. This far from my eyeball. And then he wove a whole scenario out of that was totally untrue. That it was my problem. That I was deliberately sabotaging him because he hadn't chosen Jay, he'd chosen this guy. And that was that's the reality that he created around the whole show. That the problem was my fault. There was a third director who only came in once in a while, and I can see him now. He was sitting up on the counter, and he gave me a direction. He said to me, he was rehearsing us sort of offhandedly in the makeup room, and he said, "I want you to speak up, talk more urgently to him." I said, "But that doesn't make any sense." He said it so gently that that wouldn't be the right response. He said, "Don't come in here with your problems with Martin." Well, I jumped up out of the chair. I grabbed him by the throat and I said, "Don't turn me into a hack just because you are." And then I saw myself, what I had just done. If I had pressed that thing in the aorta in judo, you can kill somebody right away, I could have been up for manslaughter. I realized my whole personality, first of all, this thing was like a rock, solid. It was from tension and stress. I could barely turn my head. I still have problems that never went away from that. 2 years of going through this. And I did something. I realized that I had to do something. They wouldn't let me have an agent. They wouldn't let me have this. I went down to the tower at ABC and learned for the first time where the big brass all were, and went up in the tower, and I went to Josie Emmerich, who was the vice president in charge of daytime television. And I told her, "You have got to do something. My 3-year contract is coming up. I am supposed to be a tentpole character here. I'm supposed to be here to the end of time. I have got to be. I am now in my 50s. For 40, I was on the borderline of 49, 50, 51, right around in there. I said, I have to be able to. I am not married. Now I feel I never will. I said, I have got to be able to. I cannot stay on this job unless something is done about this. So she pretended to be, I think she was concerned. She's a decent woman. She's a very decent woman, Josie Emmerich. She's a nice woman. But I knew, coming down in that elevator, there is no one watching your back but you. Now get yourself together and you do what you have to do. And I realized that when even though it meant I decided that I was going to quit the job. First of all, I realized that by her saying that it was over. That let me know if it's still, that she wasn't going to do anything about it. Not because she's not a good person, but because she's, this is what I figured out. And it would take me years to figure out. Still, I hadn't begun to figure out what was really happening to me on that show. That's the weird part of it. Josie Emmerich is just management. Josie Emmerich is smart enough to know there are all kinds of people that can replace her. There's only one Agnes Nixon. There is only one person who has the genius to create 15 hours of employment in a single week for a network. This was a woman who had the 2-hour shows and 2 half-hour shows that eventually wilted. Loving and Port Charles. That's one from these three, the 2-hour shows and the 2 half-hour. 5 times a week. That's 15 hours of employment. She's unique. And what I learned was that the person who can't be replaced is the person who owns the chessboard. Everything that happened to me, she's up there with the chessboard. So Josie Emmerich isn't going to do a damn thing about it because Agnes was the one who got rid of Doris. And Agnes is the one who wants it this way and that way and so on and blah, blah. And Joe Stewart is her protege. She adores him. When I got down to the lobby, I had made up my mind that it was better, even though I didn't know what in God's name I was going to do. My situation was so ugly and filthy and dirty and ugly, and I hated it so much. I would be happier working at the end of a counter, not even being the cashier, but being at the end of the thing, bagging the groceries. I could get a job like that, and that was better than what was going on with me. When I got down to the lobby, I experienced a respect for myself that I had never had before. And I felt, oh, the release, I can't tell you. So I was very nice about it when the day came. I made it very clear. I went out and got an agent to get me out of the job, so I didn't have to talk to them. He made it very clear she's going to be very grateful about it. You only have to pay this little bit of money more to make it clear she's doing you the favor. She's willing to let the writers have as much time as they need to gracefully get her out. But she is quitting the job. And so I fled the show and had the usual theater experience of 3 years in which there was no work, like a desert, and in the middle of that desert, a gorgeous oasis, as usual, from the theater. I was called, I forget what his name was. He was, at the time, the grand guru of theater and academe, up at the Harvard Repertory, American Repertory up at Harvard. You're aware of it, that's good, because he was, anyway, he called me on the phone and he asked me, but there was never any question of audition because in the theater people respected me enough that they only called me when they planned to use me. I never ever auditioned. He asked me if I would be willing to play Dolores Del Rio in the world premiere of Orchids in the Moonlight by Carlos Fuentes, the famous Mexican writer, and Roz Cash, another black actress who was sort of light-skinned like me, because we had to look somewhat alike, was going to play Maria Felix. Would I go up and do it? Well, would I? Oh, I couldn't wait. It was the most extraordinary experience. I mean, it was the Orchids in the Moonlight. He took, because he was talking about women, the 2 Mexican women who had made themselves into international stars. International stars. Dolores Del Rio in Hollywood and Maria Felix in Paris. And he had this fantasy where, and it was obviously a fantasy because it's not history, the two of them settled down in this villa where Lord Byron used to be, in Venice, in Italy, and they start talking about their careers. And that's the thing that they are trading experiences from a joint thing, and when they'd been such. And then as the thing goes on, you begin to realize that there's something very strange going on, and you're dealing with something that is completely different than you thought you were. And then you realize you're not in Venice, in Italy. You're in Venice, California. And when you look out the window, something else is going on. And you realize that these people have nothing to do with Dolores Del Rio and Maria Felix. They're dress extras in an insane asylum, imagining that they're these people. And oh, it's incredible. Oh, my God. It's one of the most brilliant plays I've ever read. Fantastic. And it became, it didn't pay that well because it's a LORT contract, you're out of town, you're whatever, or so on. But that piece of material is so extraordinary. Playing those roles was just devastating. It was fabulous. It made such, I got such incredible, when the world premiere came, all sorts of, because he was in the international swim as, he had also been the ambassador to Paris. Dukes and duchesses from whatever, they flew in on their own planes to come to the world premiere. And we got fabulous reviews. Everybody started talking about bringing it to off-Broadway. And Roz Cash and I were playing, she was playing Maria Felix, I was playing Dolores Del Rio. We were smart enough to know that even though we were making only a little bit of money, this was one of the experiences of a lifetime because the play was just extraordinary. We didn't go to the cafeteria and save our money by eating at the Automat or the whatever. We would go to some wonderful restaurant, and it was just the two of us, and then the person who came in at the very end, and that's where you begin to realize you're dealing with whatever. We would go and have wonderful meals, and we would chat with each other about, we had joining dressing rooms, and we'd talk about it all. It was just gorgeous. And then it closed, and it was all gone, because people were talking about bringing it to Broadway. But this is one of the ironies of my life. The Hispanic community had heard about it and were very upset that Roz and I were playing the role. What they didn't realize, I wish I could direct, because if I had that script, it would be even more extraordinary if they were transgender women, who the kind that really fool you. So they're even further away from where and Carlos, in the very second page of his script, writes that it must not be played by the real thing. It must not be played by, it must be played by people who look like it. Mm-hmm. And then you pull them as far back as you possibly can. But you can't explain that in a nuance too. And Roz and I, because what we have gone through as women replaced by white women playing black women, passing for white women, well, the whole number, mm-hmm. we're totally in sympathy with them. So we weren't about to sit and fight for what we knew could have, if it had come to off-Broadway in New York, probably rocketed both of our careers to God knows where. But once again, irony has the day. But that was the one thing. So I say that to say that when 3 years after that desert, when Agnes Nixon was about to open Loving, and she took her darling protege, Joe Stewart, and put him over there on her chessboard, and then put a wonderful woman called,
Jean Arley?
Jean Arley there. Jean Arley asked me back. And she was lovely. And for the first time in my life, and in Lillian's, because Lillian had been there all the way through, in my life and Lillian's, both of us felt that for the first time in our lives, we were really treated like stars. Valuable, valuable stars by Jean Arley. Once again, I adore her because that was the one wonderful. The problem was the writing was disturbing everybody because the person who had taken over, George Russell, the person,
Gordon Russell?
Gordon, that's
the original head writer.
Yes, right. Gordon was an excellent writer. There wasn't much he could do with my storyline, but he did the best he could. And he was a wonderful writer. But he, too, died in his, I think he was in his 30s or 40s. He was very young, but he had done a wonderful job of taking over for Agnes, because Agnes is a brilliant writer, and when he took over, it was almost, it didn't make any difference because Gordon was so wonderful himself. Mm-hmm. But after Gordon died, the writing had apparently turned into very different hands that everybody was screaming about. I walked on to, first of all, when I left the show, the first thing I immediately did, in case anybody ever asked me back, was sit down and write a storyline called Caller Returns to Llanview. So there's still a script in my drawer called Caller Returns to Llanview. Oh dear. That I put away. I got it out. Jean Arley offered it to them because she thought it was so interesting, and it would have been. It was a fascinating script I had written to return me to the show.
What was the storyline?
Oh, it was very interesting because the guy who looks like he's going to be the Prince Charming is not. He's a villain, and she comes back all battered in a wheelchair and all strange and whatever. People don't know what's going on because they happen to go into this town where something happened. That it was a very arresting thing. And obviously, because when Jean Arley put it, my agent, because I refused to go, when I sat down with Jean Arley, I said to Jean Arley, when I was asked to go back, I went back. I had learned my lesson about agents. I insisted, I'm not going back. I knew I could not, I had no leverage, those people could knock me silly. So I said to Jean Arley's people, I did it through Mary Jo Slater, who did the casting. Jean Arley had lunch with me, it worked out very well, but I said to Mary Jo, I have to be able to go back with the guy who got me out of it. I want to deal with him as my agent to put me back into it. I said, look, I'm a lot smarter than I was. I now know that the white girls make $1 million or more. I'm not going back at $75,000. You have to at least give me $150,000. I can make something out of $150,000.
And the show was an hour long at that point.
At that point, it was an hour long. Mm-hmm. But what I had learned so much from just keeping my ears open that I was much smarter when I went back, because I said I can make a life for myself. So what I did was when Jean Arley wanted me back, I said they put the agent that I had asked for. They let him. I said to him, I'm going to California to visit friends. Don't call me on the phone unless they pay me $150,000 because I can make a life out of it. I'm not going back to 1 penny less. I said, please don't call me. You do the hard work. So I went out to California and I didn't pay any attention at all, because the idea of sitting by a phone as they went up to this and this and I wasn't going to sit still for it. I said, I've had to sit still for everything that they put in front of my face. This time, I'm calling it. It's my way or the highway this time. And he called me up a month later and figured enough time was passing that we had better take what we were getting. I said, I told you, Martin, I forget his last name now, but I said, I told you, don't call me unless they're ready to give me that full. I said, I've done it their way. This time they have to do it my way. So it took another, half a month. I couldn't have cared less. And they finally came up with the full 150,000. Then I knew exactly what to do. I immediately incorporated so that I could pay myself 50,000 because that's all I was used to living on. That would do fine. I'd send 50,000 to Uncle Sam, and I put 50,000 into something pension plan. I forget what the technical name is. It's a pension plan that you set aside for a limited something pension plan or whatever, that was going to build up my future. Mm-hmm. And I also, because I was tired of the ride back here to Westchester, because I was going back home, so to speak, I put the down payment on Park Vendôme was turning from a hotel into an apartment house with condos. I bought a condo there. That was it was adorable. It was a little studio apartment right near the Carnegie Hall area and Henri Bendel and all those things and what have you and so on. And I started decorating it because that's where I was going to retire and where I was going to be in town to go see theater and actors who I love to go see and go to art galleries and what have you and so on. I went back and...
Let's halt for one sec,
yes.
Just for sound.